Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a new Robotech video. Going to be taking some time today and talking about the RDF between the wars, and primarily I'm talking about the first and second Robotech wars. And that's because there was actually a lot going on before the beginning of the Master Saga. And yeah, the RDF was pretty busy little beavers at the time. And we partially know this because of the video game Robotech Battlecry. It covered mostly what was going on Earth after Chiron's reign of death. So let's get on into some of the events itself. Now, the first thing is pretty much the fracturing of the United Earth government. Now, looking at it perceivably, it looks like the United Earth government stayed around, but it looks like a lot of the member countries, if you will, had left the United Earth government, feeling that, well, that didn't work. Of course, I guess it makes a lot of sense considering that most of the Earth had been wiped out. Also, during this time frame, you see the formation of the Southern Cross. You see some shifting within the RDF because the REF is formed, which is the Expeditionary Force. They're more or less Space Force, if you will, while the RDF is primarily a defense force for Earth itself. You also have the rebanning of the Soviet Union as EPSIS. I've talked about this a few times. I'm not really going to touch too much on this, but there is going to be a couple moments that there's going to be a few moments where they're going to appear in this video, which is why I'm going to discuss or kind of bring them up. And then in this period, you also have the production, or at least the beginning part of the production of the SDF-3, as well as other more advanced warships for the REF. There's also the VF-1X prototype, which is actually a prototype for the VF-A6, also known as the Alpha Fighter. So that was something that came about as well during this time period. We also start to see the early Cyclone models. Now understand, I'm pulling these parts, these bits and pieces out from some of the Palladium source books. So take it for what you will. It's not really canon, but it does make sense when you put it under a scope. Another thing that would go into full production would be the VF-1R, which, like I said, would see full production. They would become a more common model. However, with that being said, the RDF was still pretty reliant on older models of mechs and Veritechs to kind of keep the wheels on the bus, if you will, and defend everything. This is also a time frame where you start to see Southern Cross mecha, and, well, Zentradi and human relations really are not the best. And that's even outlined through Robotech, the series itself, that relations really aren't the best between the RDF and the Zentradi. Most Zentradi kind of bugger off on their own and essentially form small militias. And after so long, actually becomes a pretty major rebellion. And that's kind of what we're going to dig into with the first source book I'm actually going to talk about, or that I'm going to be pulling information from to kind of hone in a little bit more, if you will, is Zentradi Breakout. And that's generally, the title pretty much says it all right there. Now, it is set in South America, so we kind of get to see a different part of the world than that's typically highlighted in the Macross Saga or any other Robotech sources, if you will. And primarily the context is the various armies, militaries, if you will, within South America has actually been pretty much handling the Zentradi on their own with essentially their own primitive level vehicles. That being said, they're not really primitive level. They're just primitive level compared to what the RDF had. And basically, these armies actually fought the Zentradi into a pocket, which is what kind of caused a problem. So even though essentially the Zentradi are using more or less ramshackle mecha, trying to keep things, trying to keep the wheels on the bus, even though they keep falling off, and they're beaten and battered, they decide to go for a bold attack and actually push out against the South American forces. And essentially, in turn, the RDF ends up responding and helping the forces fight back the Zentradi rebellion. I feel overall it's pretty good because it does give us an idea of what's kind of going on around the world and what the political climate is like, if you will, before the invasion of the Masters and the beginning of the Second Robotech War. Another source book that was actually in between the two wars is Strike Force. Now, this one, the context is fairly similar, but not really quite similar. Essentially, this one is set in Indonesia. And because of the rough terrain and the jungles and everything else, it makes it actually hard for the RDF to track the Zentradi forces. And also, with that being said, the Zentradi forces are quite small, or quite well prepared, and actually band together Micronian troops, if you will, basically slave forces, which adds a bit more difficulty for the RDF when they actually finally do track down the Zentradi forces. The terrain also makes things really difficult for RDF forces to kind of track where the Zentradi forces are. And, well, I hate to say it, it's kind of like Vietnam all over again. It's just this time the Bushes are speaking Zentradi instead of Vietnamese. And it leads into some very tough jungle fighting. With all that being said, though, they really do, when you actually go through the setting or the module, if you will, the adventure module, you actually do find the Zentradi. And yeah, you find actually a well-equipped, well-prepared, well-motivated Zentradi force that's ready to fight tooth and nail. It's actually really interesting. It's a pretty tough situation overall, and I think it's a great situation to really use for any Robotech campaign, if you will, even including the more modern Strange Machine Games version of Robotech. You'd be able to do something like this with the information that they provide in their books. Now, another one that gets really interesting is another adventure module, which is once again set in the same time frame, and that's actually Ghost Ship. So the thing to understand is after the first Robotech war is over, there's essentially just a big debris field of derelict Zentradi ships, as well as there's some Earth ships within there as well. And essentially the RDF continuously patrols that debris field. And there's multiple reasons why. One of those is actually an increase in space pirates. Yes, Robotech has space pirates, which under scope kind of makes sense. And of course, they're actually using combat capable shuttlecraft to essentially go out into space, collect scrap, bring that scrap back to Earth, and sell that scrap. And essentially, the United Earth government has actually deemed this illegal, that no one should be allowed to have any claim on that scrap or anything, that it should be a no-go zone. Which actually causes some problems with EPSIS, because EPSIS, at the same time, is one of the primary purchasers of said scrap from those space pirates, because they're using the scrap to try and produce their own Robotech vehicles, if you will, their own version of robotechnology. And essentially their feelings is, well, it's out in space, it's free claim. So actually there is tensions brewing in this source book between the United Earth government and EPSIS, which would make pretty logical sense, as EPSIS is trying to become a power player on the board. Now, what's kind of cool about this one, though, is actually within the debris field, there is actually an active Zentradi ship that's kind of hanging out, using dampener fields to cloak it from any type of scanning arrays or anything like that. Basically, it's hiding life signs. So everybody thinks it's a dead derelict ship, but it's actually not. It's a fully operational Robotech factory for the Zentradi, or at least I think it's a Robotech factory. Either way, that don't really matter, because it's still pretty interesting, pretty cool, and like I said, it's something you could do in your Robotech campaign, even without the source books. This just kind of gives you some ideas. Anyway, if anybody would like me to actually take a deeper dive into any of these source books, I would be more than glad to. Comment down below. Let me know which one would interest you the most. But anyway, folks, I am going to wrap up today's video. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video and have yourselves a wonderful day.